The wedding shoes. The sun hung low over the Nebraska plains, casting long shadows across Thomas McKenna's weathered farm. Dust motes danced in the amber light that streamed through the kitchen window, settling on the worn wooden table where he sat with his evening coffee. The silence was profound, the kind that had become his unwelcome companion these past 3 years since Mary's passing. Thomas pushed 60 now, his hands gnarled from decades of wrestling sustenance from the unforgiving soil. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and deep lines etched stories of drought, loss, and solitude into his face. The farm that had once bustled with Mary's laughter and the promise of children who never came now stretched before him like a monument to loneliness. He was about to light his evening pipe when movement caught his eye through the window. A figure approached from the eastern trail. Small, stumbling, barely more than a shadow against the dying light. Thomas set down his coffee and stepped onto the porch, shading his eyes with a calloused hand. It was a girl, couldn't be more than 16, walking with the unsteady gait of someone who had traveled far beyond the limits of endurance. Her dress, once blue, was now the color of dirt and desperation. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her thin shoulders. But it was her boots that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. They were dark with blood. The girl stumbled, caught herself against his fence post, and looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for such a young face. Green eyes, the color of prairie grass after rain. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came, only a small, strangled sound that spoke of a throat raw from screaming or crying or both. Thomas descended the porch steps slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal. The girl watched him, poised to flee despite her obvious exhaustion. When he was close enough to see the freckles scattered across her nose like stars, he stopped. "Easy now," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "Ain't gonna hurt you, child." The girl's gaze darted from his face to the farmhouse behind him, then back again. Her fingers clutched at her torn skirt, and Thomas could see the tremor in her hands. The boots, men's boots, far too large for her small feet, left dark prints in the dust. "You hurt?" Thomas asked gently. She shook her head quickly, then nodded, then shook her head again, as if she couldn't decide which truth to tell. Thomas had seen enough in his years to recognize the look of someone running from something terrible. He'd witnessed it during the war, in the faces of refugees fleeing burned-out homesteads. He'd seen it in Mary's eyes the day the doctor told them she'd never carry a child to term. "Well," he said, hooking his thumbs in his suspenders, "reckon you could use some water and a place to sit." Without waiting for an answer, he turned and walked back toward the house, trusting that she would follow. After a moment, he heard the soft scuff of those bloody boots against the ground behind him. On the porch, Thomas gestured to Mary's old rocking chair, the one he could never bring himself to sit in. The girl lowered herself into it carefully, as if afraid it might disappear. He brought her a tin cup of water from the well, and she drank it in desperate gulps, water spilling down her chin. "More?" he asked. She nodded, and he refilled the cup. This time she drank more slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. When she finished, she set the cup on the porch rail with shaking hands. "What's your name, child?" For a long moment she just stared at him, then in a voice barely above a whisper, "Sarah." "Well, Sarah, I'm Thomas McKenna. This here's my farm." He settled onto the porch step, keeping his distance so as not to spook her. "You hungry?" She nodded, and he went inside to fetch some bread and cold beef from his meager supper. She ate like someone who hadn't seen food in days, tearing at the bread with small, desperate bites. As she ate, Thomas studied those boots. They were a man's work boots, scuffed and worn, with blood that looked both fresh and old. The laces were tied too tight, probably to keep them from falling off her small feet. Below the hem of her dress, he could see her ankles were raw and bleeding where the leather had rubbed. "Sarah," he said carefully, "where'd you come from?" Her hands stilled on the bread. She looked toward the east, the direction from which she'd come, and her face went pale as milk. "Don't matter now," she whispered. "Might matter to whoever's looking for you." Her eyes snapped to his, wide with fear. "No one's looking," she said quickly. "No one." But Thomas had lived long enough to recognize a lie, even a desperate one. He also recognized the look of someone who would rather die than go back to wherever they'd come from. "All right," he said. "No one's looking." The relief that flooded her face nearly broke his heart. As darkness settled over the plains, Thomas lit the oil lamp on the porch. Crickets began their evening song, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Sarah had finished eating, and now sat very still in Mary's chair, watching the shadows lengthen. "You can't walk much further in them boots," Thomas said finally. Sarah looked down at her feet, and for the first time, tears spilled over her lower lashes. "I ain't got nothing else." Thomas was quiet for a long time, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Nebraska sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "My wife Mary,
She passed 3 years ago come October. Pneumonia took her. He paused, clearing his throat. She had small feet like yours. Kept her things in a trunk upstairs. Sarah's hands gripped the arms of the rocking chair. I couldn't. Thomas rose and went inside, his footsteps heavy on the wooden stairs. In the bedroom he'd once shared with Mary, moonlight slanted through the window onto the cedar trunk at the foot of the bed. He hadn't opened it since the day after the funeral, when he'd carefully folded away her dresses and put away her brush and mirror. His hands trembled as he lifted the heavy lid. The scent of lavender sachets rose up to greet him, along with memories so sharp they made his chest ache. There, beneath her Sunday dress and winter coat, were Mary's shoes, the wedding shoes. White leather, carefully preserved, with tiny pearl buttons running up the sides. Mary had ordered them special from St. Louis, spending money they could barely afford because she wanted everything to be perfect for their wedding day. She'd worn them exactly once, walking down the aisle of the little church in town, her hand in his, her face radiant with joy. Thomas lifted them carefully, feeling their familiar weight. Mary had been so proud of those shoes, had shown them to every woman in the county. After the wedding, she'd wrapped them in tissue paper and declared they were too beautiful to wear for every day. Save them for special occasions, she'd said. But the special occasions had never come. They'd been too poor for fancy parties, too busy with the farm for social calls. The shoes had remained in the trunk, waiting for a day that never arrived. Thomas carried them downstairs, his throat tight with emotion. Sarah was still sitting in the rocking chair, staring out at the darkness. When she saw what he carried, her breath caught. I can't, she whispered. They're too fine, too. Take off them boots, Thomas said quietly. Sarah hesitated, then slowly bent to unlace the bloody boots. When she pulled them off, Thomas could see that her feet were a mess of blisters and cuts. The socks she wore beneath were more whole than fabric. Without a word, Thomas knelt before the rocking chair and gently lifted one of her feet. Sarah flinched but didn't pull away as he examined the damage. Her feet were small and narrow, just like Mary's had been. He went inside and returned with a basin of warm water and some clean rags. Sarah watched in silent amazement as he cleaned her wounds with gentle hands, dabbing away the blood and dirt with the same care he might show a newborn calf. When her feet were clean and dry, he picked up one of Mary's wedding shoes. These belong to my wife, he said softly. She was about your size, I reckon. Sarah shook her head frantically. I can't take a dead woman's shoes. It ain't right. Mary would have wanted them worn, Thomas said. She always said it was a shame to keep beautiful things locked away. He slipped the shoe onto Sarah's right foot, his weathered fingers working the tiny pearl buttons with surprising deftness. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. The second shoe went on just as easily. When he finished, Sarah stared down at her feet in wonder. In the lamplight, the white leather seemed to glow against her bruised and dirty legs. She wiggled her toes, marveling at how the shoes seemed to cradle her feet like gentle hands. They're beautiful, she breathed. Thomas stood, his knees creaking with the effort. He picked up the bloody boots and carried them to the edge of the porch, setting them down where they couldn't be seen from the road. Thank you, Sarah said, and her voice broke on the words. Thomas nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in his throat. He settled back onto the porch step, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. My pa, Sarah said suddenly, he ain't a good man. Thomas waited, understanding that this was her story to tell in her own time. He drinks, she continued, her voice barely audible, and when he drinks he gets angry. Ma died birthing my baby brother 2 winters ago, and Pa, he blamed me for not taking better care of her. Her hands twisted in her lap, said it was my fault she died, that I didn't help enough, didn't pray hard enough. The words came slowly, painfully, like pulling splinters from a wound. Last week he came home drunk, and he said I was old enough to take Ma's place, in all ways. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. I told him no, and he hit me, hard, knocked me clean across the room. Thomas felt his hands clench into fists, but he kept his voice gentle. That when you ran? Sarah shook her head. Not then. I was too scared. But yesterday, she took a shuddering breath. Yesterday he tried again, and when I fought him off, he said he'd kill me, said no one would miss a worthless girl like me. Her hand went to her throat, and Thomas could see the faint marks of fingers in the lamplight. I grabbed them boots, they were my pa's, and ran. Been walking ever since. The blood, Thomas asked quietly, cut my feet something fierce. Them boots don't fit right, and I've been walking on rocks and thorns for 2 days. Thomas was quiet for a long time, processing her words. He'd known men like her father during the war, men who took their anger and frustration out on those weaker than themselves. It made his stomach turn. Your pa report you missing? Sarah let out a bitter laugh. Pa don't care enough to report nothing. Probably figured good riddance. She looked down at the wedding shoes again. I ain't got nowhere to go, Mr. McKenna. No family that would take me. No money for a train ticket. I've been walking toward California. Heard there might be work in the orchards, but California's a long way, Thomas said. I know. Her voice was small, defeated. Probably won't make it anyhow. Thomas studied her profile in the lamplight, the determined set of her jaw, the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone trying to take up as little space as possible. She reminded him of Mary in some ways, though Mary had never known the kind of fear that lived in this girl's eyes. "I got a proposition for you," he said finally. Sarah turned to look at him, wariness flickering across her face. "Winter's coming on," Thomas continued. "This farm's too much for one man to manage alone. Could use help with the cooking, the cleaning, maybe the animals. Ain't much, but there's a roof over your head and 3 meals a day." Sarah's eyes widened. You'd let me stay?" "Got a spare room," Thomas said. "Was going to be a nursery, but—" He cleared his throat. "Point is, it's yours if you want it. No questions asked, no obligations. You help around the farm, I'll give you room and board. Come spring, if you still want to head to California, I'll give you money for a train ticket." For a moment, Sarah just stared at him, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Then tears began to spill down her cheeks in earnest. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Thomas was quiet for a long time, gazing out at the star-filled sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "Mary and me, we tried for years to have children. Lost 3 babies before they could draw breath. And after that," he shrugged, "guess the good Lord had other plans. But Mary, she always said our home was meant to have young voices in it. Maybe this is his way of making that happen." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I ain't much for cooking. I'll teach you. Don't know nothing about farming neither. I'll teach you that too. What if my pa comes looking?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Sarah, any man who'd threaten to kill his own daughter ain't no kind of father at all. You don't owe him nothing." Sarah looked down at the wedding shoes again, wiggling her toes in the soft leather. "Mrs. McKenna, Mary, she wouldn't mind? About the shoes, I mean." Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest, the first he'd felt in 3 long years. Mary always believed that beautiful things were meant to be shared, not hidden away. She'd be tickled pink to see them on someone who needed them. That night, Thomas made up the small room that had been intended for the children who never came. He found some of Mary's simpler dresses in the trunk, mended the tears and let out the seams where needed. When he knocked on Sarah's door the next morning, she emerged wearing a blue calico dress and Mary's wedding shoes, her hair combed and braided neatly down her back. "Morning," she said shyly. "Morning," Thomas replied. "Ready to learn how to milk a cow?" Over the following weeks, the farmhouse slowly came back to life. Sarah threw herself into learning with the determination of someone who had nowhere else to go and everything to prove. She burned the first batch of biscuits, spilled milk all over the kitchen floor, and got chased by the rooster more times than she could count. But she never complained, never gave up. Thomas found himself looking forward to mealtimes, to the sound of her humming while she worked, to her endless questions about everything from crop rotation to the names of the stars. She was quick to learn and eager to please, but more than that, she was kind. She talked to the animals like they were old friends, rescued spiders from the house instead of squashing them, and always saved the best portions of dinner for Thomas. "You don't have to do that," he told her one evening, pushing the larger piece of chicken back toward her plate. "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "You saved my life, Mr. McKenna. Least I can do is make sure you eat proper." "Thomas," he corrected. "Just Thomas." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "All right, Thomas, but I'm still giving you the bigger piece." As autumn painted the plains in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas began to notice changes in himself as well. He whistled while he worked, something he hadn't done since Mary's death. He found himself planning meals that Sarah might enjoy, picking up fabric in town for a new dress, even considering repairs to the farmhouse that he'd been putting off for years. The wedding shoes became Sarah's everyday footwear, their white leather gradually acquiring the scuffs and stains of farm life. Thomas had worried she might treat them like precious objects, too valuable to wear, but Sarah seemed to understand intuitively that shoes were meant for walking. "Mary would have liked you," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Sarah looked up from the socks she was mending. "You think so?" "I know so. You got her spirit, that way of making everything around you feel warmer, more alive." Sarah blushed and ducked her head. "I ain't special like she was." "You're special in your own way," Thomas said gently. "Don't ever let anyone tell you different." As winter approached, there was still no word from Sarah's father. Thomas had made discreet inquiries in town, asking the sheriff to keep an ear out for any missing person reports, but nothing had come through. It seemed Sarah had been right. Her father hadn't bothered to look for her. The realization made Thomas both relieved and heartbroken. Relieved because it meant Sarah was safe. Heartbroken because he couldn't fathom a parent who cared so little for their child. On the first snowy day of December, Sarah surprised him by pulling a carefully wrapped package from behind her back. "What's this?" Thomas asked, accepting the bundle with curious hands. "Early Christmas present," Sarah said, bouncing slightly on her toes. "Open it." Inside the brown paper were 2 wool socks, knitted with careful, even stitches. Thomas held them up, marveling at the workmanship. "Sarah, these are beautiful. When did you—" "Been working on them in the evenings after you go to bed," she said proudly. "Mrs. Henderson in town taught me the pattern. Said every man needs warm feet in winter." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. It had been so long since anyone had made something just for him, had thought about his comfort and well-being.
"Thank you," he said hoarsely. "These are the finest socks I've ever seen." Sarah beamed, and Thomas realized that somewhere along the way, this scared, broken girl had become the daughter he'd never had. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Thomas cleared his throat nervously. "Sarah, I've been thinking about the spring, and that train ticket to California." Sarah's hand stilled on her knitting. "Yes, sir? Well, I was wondering, that is, if you'd be agreeable, maybe you might consider staying on permanent life. As my daughter." Sarah's knitting fell to her lap. "Your daughter. I know I ain't young, and I know I ain't much of a catch as fathers go," Thomas said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "But I've grown mighty fond of having you here, and I think Mary would have wanted, that is, if you're willing." Sarah launched herself from her chair and threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking him over. "Yes," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Yes, yes, yes." Thomas hugged her back, his heart fuller than it had been in years. "We'll make it legal like," he promised. "Adoption papers and everything. You'll be Sarah McKenna, if you want." "Sarah McKenna," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like that." Outside, snow continued to fall on the Nebraska plains, blanketing the farm in pristine white. But inside the little farmhouse, two people who had found each other in their darkest hours sat by the fire, finally home. Spring came early that year, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. Sarah had grown 3 inches over the winter, and filled out some, though she was still small and delicate. The wedding shoes had taken on the comfortable, lived-in look of footwear that was truly loved. On a warm April morning, as Thomas and Sarah worked together in the garden, a rider approached from the east. Thomas straightened, shading his eyes against the sun, and felt his blood run cold when he recognized the man's build and daring. Sarah had seen him too. She went very still, her face draining of color. "That him?" Thomas asked quietly. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. The man who rode into their yard was everything Thomas had expected, and worse. Unshaven, unwashed, with the red-rimmed eyes of a habitual drunk. His horse was thin and poorly cared for, and the man himself swayed slightly in the saddle, even though it was barely past noon. "Sarah," he called out, his voice slurred. "Sarah, you get out here right now." Thomas stepped protectively in front of Sarah, who had shrunk back toward the farmhouse. "You're on private property, mister. State your business." The man's bleary gaze fixed on Thomas with obvious dislike. "Business is with my daughter." "Sarah, I know you're here, girl. Folks in town said they seen you." "Sarah's not going anywhere," Thomas said calmly. The man dismounted clumsily, nearly falling in the process. Up close, Thomas could smell the whiskey on him, could see the mean glitter in his eyes. This was a man accustomed to getting his way through violence and intimidation. "She's my daughter," the man snarled. "Mine, and she's coming home with me whether she likes it or not." "Actually," Thomas said, pulling the folded papers from his shirt pocket, "she's not. These here are legal adoption papers, filed with the county clerk. Sarah McKenna is my daughter now." Sarah's father stared at the papers with the uncomprehending look of a man who couldn't read. "That don't mean nothing," he spat. "She's my blood, my property." "Children ain't property," Thomas said firmly. "And even if they were, you lost any claim to her the day you laid hands on her." For a moment the two men faced each other across the dusty yard, one representing everything good and decent, the other embodying the worst of human nature. Then Sarah's father made a move toward his saddle, where Thomas glimpsed the butt of a rifle. Thomas was faster. His own rifle, leaning against the porch rail, was in his hands before the other man could clear his weapon from its scabbard. "I wouldn't," Thomas said quietly. Sarah's father froze, his hand still reaching for his gun. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of wind through the wheat fields. "Here's how this is going to go," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his chest. "You're going to get back on that horse and ride away. You're going to forget this place exists. Forget Sarah exists. And if I ever see you on my land again, if I ever hear tell of you bothering her in any way, I'll kill you where you stand."
The other man opened his mouth to argue, but something in Thomas's eyes must have convinced him that the threat was real. With a curse, he swung back into the saddle. "This ain't over," he called out as he wheeled his horse around. "Yes, it is," Thomas replied, and somehow the quiet certainty in his voice made it true. They watched until the rider disappeared into the distance, swallowed up by the vast prairie. Only then did Thomas lower his rifle and turn to Sarah, who was standing frozen on the porch steps. "You all right?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, though she was shaking like a leaf. "Is he really gone?" "He's really gone," Thomas assured her, "and he won't be back." Sarah looked down at her feet, at Mary's wedding shoes that had carried her so far from the darkness of her old life. When she looked up again, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for the shoes, for the home, for making me your daughter, for saving me." Thomas felt his own eyes grow damp. "You saved me too, child, more than you know." As they stood there on the porch of the little farmhouse, surrounded by the endless sky and the promise of the growing season ahead, Thomas thought about Mary and the children they'd never had. He thought about the wedding shoes that had waited so long for their purpose to be revealed, Sometimes salvation came in unexpected forms, in bloody boots and desperate flight, in small acts of kindness and second chances. Sometimes it took the shape of a broken girl and a lonely man, finding exactly what they needed in each other. The wedding shoes had finally found their special occasion. Not a wedding, perhaps, but something just as sacred, the joining of two souls who needed each other, the creation of a family born not of blood but of choice and love. And somewhere Thomas was certain, Mary was smiling. As evening painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, father and daughter sat together on the porch, planning their garden and their future. The wedding shoes rested comfortably on Sarah's feet, no longer white, but weathered and loved, ready for whatever path lay ahead. In the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song to the sunset, and all was well with the world.